The legend of Osiris is considered one of the most important ancient Egyptian literature works, if not the most important one indeed. The oldest text source about Osiris legend goes back to what's known as the Pyramids texts, which were recorded starting from the end of the 5th dynasty. But the original roots of these texts definitely belong to much older times, maybe to the pre-dynastic period, and naturally before human knew writing and started to write down his thoughts. It's difficult though to depend alone on the Pyramids texts in what's mentioned about Osiris legend and its events, in imagining and reciting the events of the legend, for the segments that talked about that are not connected with each other, and in many times they were slightly mentioned during the description or telling of one of the events concerned with the legend. In any case, what came in the Pyramids texts gives a general idea about the legend, which events and features could be completed through following up and collecting what came in the Coffins texts and the Book of the Dead and the other religious books, which mostly go back to the New Kingdom era, in addition to what came in the late Greek-Roman period and what came in the Greek sources about this legend. The Book of the Dead is considered one of the most important sources that gave a good space for Osiris legend and its events within its different chapters, in addition to what was told and acted of the events of the legend in the festivals of Osiris in Abydos, and within the rituals and the daily performances in many temples like Dendera and Edfu, and finally through the panels of the individuals like the panel of Aghar-Nefer from the Middle Kingdom. The image of the mythology came through the story of the Greek historian Plutarch in the 1st century AD and was called Isis and Osiris, and it's the best and the most complete known image of this legend, in spite of being tainted with some Greek effects and features. The events of the legend of Osiris is summarized in the struggle between the one who represents the good and the other one who represents the evil. That struggle was between Osiris and Set. Osiris was murdered by the hands of his brother Set, and his body parts were scattered. Then Isis gathered his parts and brought him back to life with the help of some gods, mainly goddess Nephthhet and Hathor. Goddess Isis got pregnant by Osiris in his son Horus, who carried on his shoulders the vengeance of his father and the inheritance of his throne, and defending it. Osiris preferred to stay in the kingdom of the netherworld and rule it, and he left the rule of the earth to his son and his legitimate heir Horus. Beside the struggle between the good and the evil, and the idea of search and revive, the legend focuses mostly on the confirmation of the legitimacy of Osiris's rule and his inheritance of his father, god Geb, and thus the legitimacy of his son Horus to take the throne after him, and the reflection of that on the legitimacy of the ruling of the kings to the country as being a divine rule, and consequently the inevitability of the inheritance of the throne within the bloodline of the ruling king, which was described as the dynasty or the bloodline of the gods. In the events of the legend, the oldest source of the legend points to Osiris being the oldest son of god Geb, the god of the earth, and goddess Nut, the sky goddess. He's represented with his brother and killer Set, in addition to goddesses Isis and Nephthys or Nephthys, the fourth generation in the Aeneid of Heliopolis, and thus he was the one entitled to inherit his father's inheritance in ruling the earth. But the greediness and enviness for the preference of his brother upon him was the reason behind his crime of killing his brother, claiming that he was the one more rightful to the throne than him. The actual beginning of what's known to be the Osiris tragic drama started with the crime of the attack of Set on his brother and killing him. There was a pointing out to this incident in a number of the pyramids and the coffins texts. The way Osiris was killed and the place where the murder happened differed from one source to another and from one story to another. Some stories said that Osiris had drowned with an arrangement or by the hands of his brother Set. One of the segments describes how the land of Memphis is fertile because of the drowning of Osiris under its water. Besides, one of the stories mentions how Isis and Nephthys salvaged the body of Osiris from the water so that he doesn't drown. In a text in a magical papyrus that dates to the late period, there is a mention of what Set has done against Osiris when he drowned his brother in the water, and each part of him was separated. The death of Osiris by drowning was connected with the funerary rituals that's represented in carrying the body of the deceased across the Nile by the boat, which Set had to do as a sort of punishment, which means that Set was the boat that carried the body of Osiris, or the deceased, and his coffin. This could be embodied in the funeral journey and the pilgrimage with the body of the deceased. Many spells and segments were told and written to provide or ask for the protection of Osiris, and consequently, the deceased in fear from the evilness of Set. So we find some paragraphs that points to the request of protection from Nut, Geb, Isis, and Horus. Among them, what came in the segments of the pyramid texts. The text says, "Hey Nut, spread your body above your son Osiris, the king. Maybe you'll hide him from Set. Hold him. You came to hide your son. You came to protect the Great One." Both goddesses Isis and Nephthys played the role of the perfect wife and sister in being loyal and lovers of Osiris, and that through their role in searching for him in all ways and in all the places of earth, and collect the parts of his torn and scattered body that's divided upon all nomes and cities. Their sorrow for Osiris was one of the best examples of sanctity and loyalty in ancient Egypt, which affected the rituals and the funerary arrangements across ages, in that there were phrases within those rituals that point and prove the sorrow of the two goddesses and their constant cry over the dead Osiris. Isis was the sister and wife of Osiris, and Nephthys was the sister of Osiris and the wife of Set, and they were both known as the two kites, or the two mourners, Gerti, in addition to the multiple representations of them in the figure of the two kites since the Old Kingdom. Many texts point to the act of Isis and Nephthys of looking for Osiris and finding his body, and their act of reassembling his parts and weeping and crying for him, in addition of their guarding him day and night and using magic in that. Later, Isis managed to bring him back to life and in getting pregnant and was able to bring an inheritant to the throne. The two sisters took the shape of the two kites in searching and crying for Osiris, and that's in resemblance to the kite which the Egyptian used to watch hovering over the cemeteries and wandering in the sky east and west, producing loud and sharp screams that resemble the screams of weeping and wailing, which coincide with the screams and mourns of the two sisters for Osiris and their search of him all across the country. It was common to picture Isis and Nephthys in that form since the New Kingdom, and we find them a lot in that shape in the scenes of the funeral and mummification, or by the sides of the coffin. Accordingly, it became a habit to picture two mourning ladies beside the coffin or the deceased, or in the funerary boat and beside the mummification bed since the 18th dynasty. One of the best sources that talk about the state of sorrow of Isis and her search of her brother and husband is a group of songs and hymns and funerary laments that were common in the late periods, like the Papyrus of Berlin 8003 and the Papyrus of Bremner Rind No. 1, which records a group of lamenting hymns on the tongues of Isis and Nephthys. These hymns were usually told by two priestesses playing the role of the two sisters, and that through celebrating Osiris's festivals in different temples. Both sisters, Isis and Nephthys, provoke sympathy and enthusiasm of the allies and supporters of gods by weeping and crying hard. Thus, the spirits of the city of Be in the Delta joined forces with Osiris and his son Horus after him by mourning and beating their chests and pulling the hair in what's known as the Dance of the Mu, that's related to the spirits of Be originally. These incidents coincide with what used to happen concerning the rituals and the feelings of the parents of the deceased in the funeral, and they are habits that's proved since the Old Kingdom in the scenes and texts that decorate the tombs of Saqqara than in the tombs of Thebes from the New Kingdom. As for cutting the body of Osiris and spreading it in most of the nomes of Egypt, there were few references to that which came in the pyramid texts and were pointed in an indirect way to the cutting of Osiris' body and distributing it. The sources that date to the late period, in particular, has mentioned that in an indirect way. Besides, the distribution of the body and parts of Osiris among the nomes and cities was a strong reason in establishing a cult and his sanctity in most of the Egyptian nomes, concerning the special importance and sanctity of the places that held his buried parts. One of the paragraphs of the pyramid text mentioned the sentence that says, "His upper leg is in Ta-Wer or Abydos, and his leg is in Ta-City or Elephantine," which is why Philae Nome or Biga had a special importance as being one of the most important places of Osiris cult in the late periods. The idea of exposing the body of god Osiris to shredding and cutting and distributing his body parts in all nomes was during the late period. Plutarch had said that when God set found Osiris's body for the second time, he cut him into 14 pieces and distributed them across the whole country, but Isis successfully managed to find them all. Gatot and Anubis succeeded in assembling them all together once again, and in mummifying Osiris's body and burying it. Some stories tell that the body was ruined, and that goddess Nut bent over the body and held his bones, and returned the heart to the body and placed the head in its place. About distributing the body of Osiris, it was said that his spinal column was buried in the city of Jeddu or Buzir, and the head was buried in Abydos. The male organ of Osiris was buried in the city of Jedet or Mendes, while the island of Philae kept his leg, and other gnomes had parts too. There was a tomb built for Osiris in each place of these places, and it was built over an island to symbolize the eternal hill inside Nun, as an embodiment of the beginning of creation and resurrection and rejuvenation. A tree was planted next to the tomb or the coffin to symbolize the resurrection of Osiris. Both sisters Isis and Nephthys had a role to preserve and mummify the body of Osiris, which is clear through some segments of the pyramid's texts and the coffins and the scenes and the different religious texts, and many signals came in the coffin's texts to assemble the organs and the bits and pieces of Osiris and embalm him within the signals of the legend. There was another sign of Anubis' role in mummifying the body of his father Osiris, and the 4 children of Horus have a role in burying Osiris by an assignment from Anubis, for they washed and purified his body, then they cried over him and opened his mouth with their copper fingers, which became the ritual done for all the dead, the ritual of opening the mouth, so that Osiris could be able to talk and eat. The story of the pregnancy of Isis with baby Horus and his birth was like a new and important subject in the Osirid mythology, as it gave it a dramatic balance in the power between good and evil. After Isis succeeded in assembling the parts of her husband's body, she gathered her magical powers and turned into a bird and flapped her wings, then blew the breeze of life into her dead husband's body. She landed above him, so he gained back his life, and Isis accepted his sperm to give birth to his son and heir Horus, who is going to inherit his father's inheritance and carry above his shoulder the revenge from his uncle and enemy Set. The most ancient texts of the pregnancy of Isis and her giving birth to Horus were in the pyramid's texts. The pregnancy of Isis and her childbirth were pictured on the walls of the temples since the 19th dynasty in the temple of King Seti I in Abydos. Osiris was able to get his life back and thrive on death, and that's with the help of his wife and sister Isis. And thus, Osiris was connected with resurrection and rebirth again. That was an important reason of the spread and popularity of the Osirid Creed, which every deceased wished to have, and to meet his destiny, and to be reborn once again in life or in the netherworld. Some segments pointed out to the resurrection of Osiris and his victory over death, including what came in the Pyramids texts. These segments were supported by many scenes and reliefs that show the resurrection of Osiris, whether on his side or his rising from his bed, like in Ibis temple and the Osiris chapels in Dendera temple, or his picturing in the form of a mummy with plants, with wheat flowers coming out of it, or with performing the famous ritual called erecting the jet column. The resurrection of Osiris was connected with many events, the first of which is a flood coming and the appearance of the plant on earth.